Hello and good evening to everyone joining in from India, and a good morning and good afternoon to those joining in from around the world. I'm Aditya Ramanathan, an associate fellow at the Takshashila institution, and welcome to this deep webinar on India-Myanmar relations. I'll start with a word about my institution. The Takshashila institution is an independent setup for research and education in public policy. We're an independent, non-partisan think tank, and we're really concerned about how India shapes the world and how the world in turn shapes India. We're also deeply focused on transforming how India is governed and exploring the intersection of technology, economics, and politics. Onto the format we're going to use for today's discussion. This format is what we call a deep webinar. These are thoughtfully curated conversations that bring together both great panelists and great discussants. I'll also say that deep webinars also work best when our audience is also engaged and asks us short questions. So everybody joining us, please feel free to pose your questions in the questions feature. Now to introduce our terrific panelists and discussants. Our two panelists today are Dr. Sandeep Shastri and Bertil Lintner. Dr. Shastri is a political scientist. He's Pro-Vice Chancellor of the JAIN University, and he's Director of its Center for Research in Social Sciences and Education. Bertil Lintner is, of course, a veteran journalist. He's well known in India. He's covered the region for years. Few people know this part of the world as well as he does, and especially the complex ties between its states. He's also written several books on the region. And also, moving on to our discussants, deep webinars, a great source of vitality is the discussants. We have Dr. P.S. Ramya. She's assistant professor at the School of Law at Presidency University here in Bangalore. And we have Dr. Sripati Narayanan. He's an independent analyst who's studied the Indo-Pacific quite deeply. So welcome to all of you. Now, our focus today is, like I said, going to be about India-Myanmar ties. In India, we don't necessarily give all our neighbors the same amount of attention. Some of them tend to grab eyeballs a lot more. But we'll try and fix that a little bit today when we talk about Myanmar and India's relations with that country. Now, of course, India-Myanmar relations are going to be contextual. There are two contexts that I can think of immediately. One is the domestic context, and we've had elections very recently in Myanmar. And the other is the international context. We can't separate the India-Myanmar relationship from the broader context of the Indo-Pacific, of the rise of China. And so we want to get into a lot of those issues and how they all tie up together and what sense we can make of them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with our two panelists and let them make some opening remarks on the state of ties and how these various other factors are influencing India-Myanmar relations. Dr. Shastri, on to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me on this panel, and it's indeed an honor to be part of this panel. I would like to use my 15 minutes to highlight two dimensions. Yes, looking at India-Myanmar relationships, but also looking at the wider context in which those relationships develop. And as I approach the theme, I would make 3-4 caveats to start off with. The first being that the prism from which I will look at the theme of today is basically the prism of a student of domestic politics. I'm not a student of international. He has been on the domestic politics and of late also of the domestic politics of Myanmar, besides the domestic politics of India. So that will be the frame from which I will look at the theme that has been allotted to me. To provide the domestic context, I will look at the 2020 elections in Myanmar and of course the 2019 elections in India and how both these elections are important in terms of understanding the possibilities when you talk about the relations between India and Myanmar. I have the benefit of looking at popular perceptions both in India and in Myanmar. In India, the popular perceptions come from the range of national election studies that I have been part of since 1996 and especially in the recent past. And in the case of Myanmar, this popular perception for me is based on the series of trips that I have made to Myanmar between 2012 and 2020. There have been more than 40 occasions that I've had a chance to go to Myanmar. I had a chance to go to all the states and all the regions. I have had the chance to dialogue with the elite groups, with those who are responsible to manage the government, those who are members of the Luto there, which is the legislature in that country. And over these 8 years, I think more than 5,000 people in Myanmar have been part of this education of mine about that country. So these popular perceptions is also something I would share. To begin with, this morning itself, I was reading the Arthashastra, and that's something I love reading. And in the Arthashastra, I was looking today at two important dimensions which I think are important for today's discussion. Chanakya's Saptanga theory, where he talks of the 7 elements that make up a state. And I found the 7th element, which I've always been intrigued by, the 7th element which Chanakya talks about, which I do not see very frequently in Western political philosophy when you talk about the elements of the state. And the 7th element of the state that Chanakya talks about is the Mitra, the friend. The Mitra as one of the key elements that make up a state. And I think for me, that particular perspective was very important when I looked at the whole range of India-Myanmar relations. The other point of the Arthashastra, which I'd like to emphasize, is a short passage where a particular message goes from Chanakya to the ruler, where he says, there are 2 things you need to keep in mind when you're dealing with another country. The first, he said, was reflect on the respond to the needs of the future. Reflect on the realities of the past and respond to the needs of the future. And I think both are important pointers to the discussion that we are having today. Now, if we provide the context of the elections in the 2 countries to be able to understand the dynamics of India-Myanmar relations, I think when you analyze the electoral outcomes in both the countries, there are certain very interesting similarities. Similarity number 1, both the elections in India and Myanmar saw the return of the incumbent. You had the BJP coming back after 5 years. You had Aung San Suu Kyi coming back with her NLD after 5 years. Both the ruling parties came back with bigger majorities. The ruling party in India came back with a bigger majority. The ruling party in Myanmar has come back with a slightly larger majority. In both the democracies, the election resulted in a greater marginalization of the opposition. The USDP has been pushed very much to the brink in Myanmar, and the Congress was not able to stage a recovery even in this election. It was not able to recover from its 2014 defeat. Let me make a last 2 zones of similarity. In Myanmar, save for the Mon state, the Rakhine state, and the Shan state, the ethnic parties did not do very well in the elections. Able to sweep the states also, except the Mon state, the Rakhine state, and the Shan states. In the Shan state, the ethnic parties won 20 of the 49 seats. In Rakhine state, 5 of the 8, and in Mon state, 2 of the 10. So they did have a presence only in these 3 states. Otherwise, the NLD swept the poll, which I think is similar to our domestic politics in India, where a large part of the opposition today seems to be coming from what I would not call regional parties, but what I would call state-based parties in India. The Congress seems to be similar in the domestic politics of the 2 countries happening. And let me add a last comparison, which I hope will stir some controversy. I think there is one more similarity in terms of the leadership. In India, just before the elections, you had strong currents of opposition to the leadership, the belief that this government may not come back to power. And then an incident happens, then Balakot happens, and then everything turns around. And the BJP is able to shift the entire election agenda from development to patriotism and nationalism. Did we see something similar happening in Myanmar this year? You had a leader who led the government who received a lot of flack outside the country. And that flack which she received outside the country helped her to build that domestic agenda, to build that domestic support, and come to where she has now come in this particular election. So I see a lot of similarities in witness in the two countries. I also must draw attention to the pragmatic nature of politics which is being practiced by both the countries. Of course, the reference to the neighborhood first and act east policies, where I think Myanmar seems to be at the forefront for India. Among the ASEAN countries, I think this is the only one we have a border with, and therefore we see that as a gateway to reach out to ASEAN. The fact that we have 4 Indian states which border Myanmar is critical in terms of our relations with Myanmar, and also the whole debate on business and trade. I think these factors are important. I also would focus on one important development, a speech made by Prime Minister Modi when he was in Myanmar in 2017. A speech where he said that we hope that all the stakeholders together can find a way out in which unity and territorial integrity of Myanmar is respected. For me, this is an important statement because I'm going to come to this point a little later, that when the West took on attacking Aung San Suu Kyi, India, I believe, played an important role of being a balancer in a sense. And the West saw the opportunity of being able to maybe neutralize the influence of China through the Indian presence or through the possible Indian influence, a point I'll come to a little later as part of my presentation. But now coming specifically to India-Myanmar relations, I think the first point, I'm going to stress 6 points when I talk about the possibilities when you look at India-Myanmar relations. I think the first is, first factor we need to keep in mind when you talk of the direction that India and Myanmar are likely to take in their relationships in the days to come. The first factor for me, I think, is the domestic compulsions that both face. Let's concede the fact that be it in Myanmar or be it in India, you do have a right of center politics which is dominating. You do have a right of center politics which is taking center stage. And I think the fact that this trend is witnessed in both the countries has important implications. And it could lead to the presence of a common ground for India and Myanmar and for the leadership of the two countries to take their dialogue forward, which brings me to my second point, that I think over the years, if you look at the leadership factor, I think both in India and in Myanmar, this would be a critical factor in terms of the building blocks for the relationships between the two countries. I think the visits that Aung San Suu Kyi has made to India, the visits that Mr. Prime Minister Modi has made to Myanmar, and the meetings that the two have had at several international
Dr. Shastri, your audio is breaking up. It might help if you turn off your video for a few minutes.
I think are important. Okay. I was mentioning that the equations that the leadership of the two countries has built up, and the images that come out, the body language that is displayed when these two leaders met, I think clearly shows that that Prime Minister Modi and Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi are geared towards a more lasting and a more stable relationship between the two countries. Now, in all my meetings with people in Myanmar, be it with the authorities, be it with the military, be it with those in the legislature. I think very clearly the China factor was a very critical factor when it came to the relations between India and Myanmar. There has been a lot of balancing that has been attempted. Now, when the West attacked Councillor Aung Suu Kyi for not doing enough in terms of the developments in the Rakhine state, I think there were two countries, India and China, which were being closely watched in terms of their response. And I think I've already quoted the statement which Prime Minister Modi made during his visit to Myanmar during those troubled times. And I think, in a sense, India could be a key player in terms of the support that it can afford to offer to Myanmar. Myanmar is looking at very important investments in trade and business. And I'm not too sure that the government of India has done enough to be able to seize the opportunity to be able to register a presence in Myanmar. The ITEC program of collaboration between India and Myanmar seems to be on the path. I remember 40 years ago, a similar program that was there between India and Afghanistan. I'm talking of the days before the Soviets went into Afghanistan. I think one of the largest programs of collaboration between two countries was between India and Afghanistan, where we had more than 800 to 1,000 Indian families which were there in Afghanistan as part of that exchange program. I know of it because those were days when I also happened to be in that country because my father was with the United Nations and we had a huge Indian community there. I think there is an opportunity for something similar to happen now in Myanmar as part of a collaboration between these two countries. I come to my final 3 points and would take a minute each to complete them. We have seen in the run-up to the election the attempt made by the military to try and intervene in important ways in this election. And that attempt to intervene was something which was rebuffed by the people in terms of the type of mandate that the voters have given. It's also important to note that there were a lot of questions which came up before the election about the army general wanting to become the president of the country, and those were seen as moves in that direction. But I think that has been very, very strongly rebuffed by the voter through the type of response that they have given. It's also interesting that the second vice president, soon after the NLD came back to power, the second vice president has reached out to ethnic parties and said that we are serious about implementing federalism as part of our second term, which I think is a very important statement, and in a sense is the response to the military, which has its own version of federalism where the recognition is not of diversity, but the recognition is of unity. So my own sense is the first term of Aung San Suu Kyi was like testing the waters. And I think the second term will see much more of wading through and a much greater capacity to be able to confront the military more directly, especially in terms of the mandate she has got. So, I believe my own personal view is that much of the silence that you saw in the first term was because she believed that any step that she took at that point of time would weaken her democratically and would strengthen the army. And therefore, she did it, I would argue, in a larger democratic interest of ensuring that her democratic base is safe and secure. My final point, I think the Myanmar vote was a very popular vote. Friends in Myanmar tell me that the way Aung San Suu Kyi and her government have handled the COVID crisis has led to a lot of support coming to them. Her daily presence on television and her daily statements on television were something which appealed to the voters, and having a very positive, pragmatic agenda as against the ethnic agendas of the various ethnic parties was, I believe, something which worked in their favor. I would conclude by making the following 3 points, and that would be my last points. I think The way forward for India and Myanmar is in recognizing the mutual interest that both have in collaborating. Uh, and I think the zones of collaboration between the two countries are very, very much visible, are opportunities which both countries would need to seize. And I think it would be useful if in fact, just 2 weeks ago, the Foreign Secretary of India and the General of our army were both in Naypyidaw and Yangon for discussions. And I believe that discussion did lead to the zones of collaboration being clearly identified. But the hope is that that will be taken forward. Finally, I would say India Myanmar relations is also in the wider context of geopolitical reality. And I think it would be important for India to seize the moment of being a friend for Myanmar who is there. That's why I went back to my Saptanga theory that an important element of the state is the friend. I think, given the equations that the leaders of the two countries have developed over time, given the fact that Aung San Suu Kyi did a important part of her education in India, I think the possibilities in a geopolitical world for India and Myanmar to come closer is visibly there. And I think it's important that the two nations and their leadership seize that opportunity at the current moment. I would stop there and come back for questions if there are any later.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shastri. You've delved into domestic politics, international relations, ties between the two countries, comparing the domestic politics between the two countries. Bertil, on to you. Your take on the elections and India-Myanmar relations.
Well, okay. Well, to be absolutely honest with you, and that's the reason why I shouldn't be, I'm not really that excited about those elections because they're not going to change the fundamental power structure of the country. And I can't see any major policy changes being on the agenda anyway. I mean, there will be more of the same, with NLD probably more firmly entrenched in parliament than they've been before, and the ethnic parties playing some role, and the USDP, the military supported party, in the background. What I would like to focus on instead is Myanmar's importance to India. Excuse me. Well, as an outsider, I mean, you don't have to be long in India before you realize that most of the attention is on your western border. And that is understandable. It's two nuclear power nations confronting each other. But I don't see any dynamics there. I can't see any possibility for change. There are no challenges really, no opportunities for progress. It will just be more of the same. I've argued for many years that it's actually your eastern border, which is your most important border when it comes to foreign relations. It's been neglected for many years, or maybe for too long. So let us look at the realities on the border then. Why is Myanmar that important to India? Well, first of all, and I have 4 points here. The first one is very obvious, security concerns. There are cross-border insurgencies. The rebels from the Naga, Manipur, and Assamese groups, which are bases on the Myanmar side of the border. From there, they've launched, excuse me, cross-border attacks into India, and then they come back to Myanmar, and there's nothing the Indian military can do about it. And for years, India has tried to have some kind of cooperation with the Myanmar military, but it's been little progress, and that is also understandable because the Myanmar military has more pressing ethnic problems elsewhere in the country that they want to focus on. It was only last year that we saw some movement in that score, and that was when the Myanmar army actually captured Taka, which was the joint headquarters for Naga, Manipur, and Assamese groups. There wasn't much fighting. I think they actually were tipped off before to get out of there. But nevertheless, the camp was abandoned. And there was a major step because it was actually the first time Myanmar had admitted that there were such camps on the territory. They denied that all along, at least to me and to others as well, when I raised the issue. But there are still more camps in the surrounding mountains, and there are connections between those camps and leaders of these groups who are living in exile in China. They're living in Tengchong, and weapons and other commodities, equipment has been obtained on the Chinese side of the border and on the border and sent across northern Myanmar to these camps. So obviously, India has a very pressing security concern there, which I think should be taken very seriously. And the second is, of course, what we've been touching on so far in Dr. Shastri's presentation and so on, that is Chinese influence in Myanmar. It is in India's interest to keep China's influence there at acceptable levels. There's no way they can disappear because China is a very powerful neighbor. But nevertheless, it is not in India's interest to have another Chinese client state on another border. I'm not saying that Myanmar is, but certainly India certainly doesn't want it to become one. The third point is, of course, the local east, which is now called the Act East policy. Myanmar is always linked between India and the lucrative markets in Southeast Asia. And if there's going to be a highway from India to Singapore one day, it would have to go through Myanmar. There's no other route available. And the fourth reason is, of course, India's rapidly growing economy needs energy. And India has shown interest in buying more oil, gas, and perhaps even hydroelectric power from Myanmar. So if you take these four factors, I would argue that that's where your most important border is. And that is, there you can actually have opportunities that we actually can do something, where some progress can be made. I can't see that on your other borders, not to the same extent in any way. And we cannot talk about India's interest in Myanmar without looking at the other powerful neighbor, China. Because since the 1980s, China has been looking at Myanmar as an outlet to the Indian Ocean for trade, for political influence, for strategic reasons, and so on. In more recent years, also it's become very important for China to avoid the congested South China Sea, the contested South China Sea and the congested Strait of Malacca. And then Myanmar is the only country that can provide such an access to the Indian Ocean. But China is a huge inland empire. And only 3 countries which border China, which also has outlets to the Indian Ocean. One is India, but I think we can forget about that. Then you got Pakistan. Yes, sure, there's a Karakoram Highway, there's Gwadar and so on. But remember that this way out in the west of China, far away from China's main industrial centers. And the Karakoram Highway is probably one of the most dangerous highways in the world when it comes to weather and terrain and so on. And then, of course, you have the political turmoil in Pakistan. Despite all the ethnic insurgencies that Myanmar has, the situation in Myanmar is still not quite as volatile and unpredictable as it is in Pakistan. So for that reason, it is understandable that what China calls the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor is one of the most important, if not the most important part of its Belt and Road Initiative, because it's the only outlet that China could possibly have to the Indian Ocean, and from there to the rest of the world, really, to Africa, to the Middle East, and to Europe. So we also know that for many years, when Myanmar was subjected to international sanctions and boycotts and so on, China was the only country that actually rallied behind the Myanmar military, which was in power during those years. But that relationship with China became a bit too uncomfortable for the Myanmar military. Because after all, regardless of what we think of them, they see themselves as the guardians of the country's independence and sovereignty. I have in my possession classified documents from the Myanmar military, which written as far back as 2004, 2005, where they say that we are in danger of losing our sovereignty or independence of China. We have to open up to the outside world, and this is the way to do it. It is exactly what they've been doing since they adopted the new constitution in 2008. But before they adopted the constitution, they made sure that it was written in such a way that it would not challenge the power or the supreme power of the military, that the military would remain the country's most powerful institution. And that power is exercised through the 25% of all the MPs, which are appointed by the military, and the fact that you cannot change this constitution unless more than 75% vote in favor of a suggested amendment, which then has to go to a referendum. So it's an extremely complicated procedure. I would say it's practically impossible to change the constitution without the military agreeing to it, of course. That's the only way. Then, of course, the military appoints the three most important ministers: defense, home affairs, which means internal security, the police and internal security apparatus, and border affairs, which leaves actually very little to the elected government and the elected members of the parliament. So what we have in Myanmar today is a kind of hybrid kind of system, where the military and the civilians sort of share powers, but where the military still remains the most powerful institution in the country. That is why I don't think this election is going to change that much, because how can it? They cannot change the constitution. There can be some adjustments here and there, but no major changes would be impossible unless the military decided that that's the way we want to move forward. And so far, there's been no signs of that at all. So the question is, so what can India do? Well, I know from my own experience inside Myanmar that the government, the military, and the general public would welcome more exchanges with India to counterbalance China, and for a number of other reasons as well. That is an aspect of Myanmar's foreign policy, but it's become even more important now after the Rohingya refugee crisis. Because I mean, when Myanmar decided to open up in 2011, 2012, the West rushed in immediately. They thought, fantastic, we have a democratic success story here. And then came the Rohingya refugee crisis. And Myanmar turned overnight from being the darling of the West to be international pariah. And I would say that the West did not really understand what was behind the conflict, and they handled it very badly. And now they have to pay the price for it. That is that they're becoming isolated from the realities inside the country. So, and naturally, China took full advantage of this situation. And they came back in a big way, trying to get the BRI projects going. The Yangon New City project must be the new city opposite the old capital, Yangon. High-speed railways and all sorts of things. But there's a lot of resistance to that in Myanmar, and not at least from the military. That is very important to remember. There are no puppets of the Chinese. I have had many discussions in private with Myanmar army officers. We have been astonished at the degree of suspicion they view not only China, but even this Aung San Suu Kyi, who they think is moving too close to the Chinese because it's been shunned by the West. They're keeping a very close eye on that, and they're not going to let the country slide back to what it was before 2010. So the question then remains, of course, what can India do? Well, increased trade is one way, but I would also like to emphasize what is usually called people-to-people relations. It's kind of cliche, but it is quite important anyway. I mean, I once led a group of Myanmar journalists to India's northeast to study India's approach to ethnic conflicts, which are very similar to their own. And they could also see how Indian journalists interact with their military, but it's very different from what they do at home. And I think this was an eye-opener for these journalists. They never expected to see this kind of thing, and so close to home. I mean, there are a lot of Western aid agencies, so they have all sort of crazy media development programs where they're taking people to Guatemala and Colombia. I always say that just go next door. You will find a lot of answers there, similarities and things you will not have in common. And I can also say it's a tiny little detail. When we were in Manipur and going to visit the Kangla fort, there's one price for foreigners and one for Indians. I was the only one who had to pay the foreigners' price. The rest they took for granted that they were locals, and they probably felt pretty local as well. And there was the other thing which I think should be explored is education. In the past, you can say the Burmese in those days, elite, when they went for higher education or for high quality education, they very often went to Darjeeling. You can meet many older Myanmar citizens who went to school there. And they're very fond memories of their time in Darjeeling and some other surrounding hill stations as well, but primarily Darjeeling. That is gone. And why not try to revive something like that? Maybe not Darjeeling this time, but at least try to encourage Myanmar students to come and study at Indian universities and higher institutions of learning. I think there would mean a lot to establish this kind of people-to-people relations, because they will meet their classmates and they remain friends for the rest of their life. And then, of course, we have security cooperation, which is much more controversial and, in a way, maybe even more important from India's long-term point of view. And here, there's been some improvements, but a lot more could be done. And when I say security cooperation, I mean meetings between the militaries of the two countries, meetings between think tanks from both countries. I am closely associated with a number of privately run think tanks in Myanmar who are desperately looking for foreign contacts and for exchanges with people outside their own country. And honestly, they feel much more comfortable dealing with a think tank in India they would do with some American or European outfit, which comes very, very often in a patronizing way, telling them what to do and what to think. They don't like that. I know that for a fact. So there are many, when you say that they could be explored. But the bottom line is what I said from the very beginning. I do believe that your eastern border is your most important border. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That's an insight we don't often get. I'm going to move on without wasting any more time to our discussants, starting with Dr. P.S. Ramya. Go ahead.
I was completely mesmerized by the two panelists and the different types of points that they brought to the table. And I'm so glad to Takshashila for giving me this opportunity, firstly, and for being part of this very pertinent conversation on Myanmar. And it's a pleasure and an honor to have to, be a discussant on, someone Bertil Lintner, who I've read profusely while doing my PhD on Myanmar, and Professor Sandeep Shastri on all the other federalism structures that he did. So it's an honor. So having said that aside, I think a lot of ground was covered in both the presentations, but I had a couple of quick questions. But before I do that, I thought it'll be an interesting exercise to first look at China-Myanmar relations, which were touched upon in both the presentations. But I thought it'll be nice to test the tenacity of where those relations are going today and how they're being perceived currently. So everybody spoke about, Lintner sir also spoke about the Karakoram Highway and the Cpec and all of that. So I thought I'll focus on Cpec, see the timing of those projects, how it's being treated differently by the Burmese government, by the Thein Sein government and today present NLD government. That is not the new government that was just formed, but prior to that, and then probably shed some light on where those relations would go. Because the underlying assumption always is that China's footprint is expanding in Myanmar. So let's test the tenacity of that assumption. To begin with, let's look at the Cpec projects itself and compare and contrast it to the Cpec projects that are happening in Pakistan. So after the initial proposal was made in November in 2017, MOUs were signed about 10 months later in September 2018. And I think 2 to 3 rounds of Cpec forum have been held in Gwanji province. And of course, Aung San Suu Kyi was made part of that as well. So in December 2018, the Myanmar government established a steering committee specifically that is headed by Aung San Suu Kyi herself to look at the implementation of these BRI projects. But during the Second Belt and Road Forum in Beijing in April, Aung San allegedly signed agreements related to about 9 Cpec projects, which were part of the Early Harvest program. Interestingly, some reports suggested that China had actually proposed up to 30 projects and Aung San had approved only 9. So that was an interesting figure that cropped up, and a lot of analysis was done as to why that shift was happening. So just for comparison, to indicate how slow Cpec, that is the China-Myanmar economic corridor, has been vis-a-vis the China-Pakistan economic corridor. In the last 5 years, Cpec was announced. Foreign direct investment in Pakistan increased by up to 240%. You saw about $930 million that were pumped into Cpec projects, about 17 Cpec projects. And the implementation, although has faced certain roadblocks, it's been given a lot of importance by Imran Khan's government, and the flow has come through to a large extent. In contrast, however, in Myanmar, the story has been a little mixed. So the numbers would suggest that China and Chinese companies are definitely investing in Myanmar. But if you look at it, usually the Belt and Road projects are associated with these big, hyper geostrategic kind of projects. But that's not been the case to a very large extent in Myanmar, unless you look at one or two. And those have been stalled to a very large extent as well. So where is this money coming in? How is it being pumped is a question that needs to be asked. So the numbers would suggest, like I said, that China and Chinese companies are investing in Myanmar. The investment strategy, however, is geared towards smaller projects instead of these mega infrastructure projects that BRI is usually associated with. Indeed, I think this is one thing that distinguishes Myanmar from the other BRI recipient countries, especially since the launch of Cpec has gained so much attention, and seeing that there's a turn, given that the international community has again kind of distanced itself from Myanmar. So how then would these projects play out? And there's been no announcement of any major infrastructure projects, at least publicly. They may come, but for the most part, they're not here yet. And I think one of the reasons for that is, of course, they say that, you have these internal conflicts that would be roadblocks. But that never stopped China from investing, because Myanmar has been plagued by these kind of internal conflicts, the center periphery dynamic, as it has been called. So what is changing now that, China is not investing that much? So probably at the cost of conjecture, and I hope our erudite panelists would also kind of give their 2 cents here. I propose that it has a lot to do with the institutional changes that Myanmar is seeing. And these changes are kind of forcing the government to heed to the antipathy of the local opinion. And usually a good example for that is how the Lapidong copper project was reinitiated at the anger and antipathy of the local population, whereas you have a mid-zone that still is currently stalled. So you do see certain checks and balances in how the Chinese interest in the investment, especially in the economic sector, geared towards CMEC, is witnessing roadblocks at different levels. And I thought that would be like an interesting angle to look at the Chinese imprint or its constriction within Myanmar. Also, the COVID diplomacy that China brought to Myanmar to a very large extent has created a kind of push and thrust that has pushed Myanmar to kind of, again, go back to these projects and get a sense of urgency to push these projects. But having said that, I think there's a generational unease that exists within Myanmar towards China. Not so much to say that that unease does not exist with India. So in my limited interactions with and my visits to Myanmar, often terms, whenever they start discussing India and India's relations, it would start firstly with the colonial period and the question of the Kala, and how, all of those other stories come up. So then you ask yourself, how then are we a better option to the Chinese? And is that a viable option then? Has these institutional, changes that are happening in Myanmar that we're witnessing correctly then make us a better option to pitch against? Because let's be realistic. In Myanmar, you do see other players who are coming in the form of Japan, specifically, who's put up a lot of new projects. You've seen South Korea and all of that. Of course, you have the Human Rights Network that is asking them to take away their money from these projects, given how the military's influence is increasing. But having said that, you do see a kind of interest. So I think one way for India to kind of push itself or its footprint, apart from these fluid identities and the roadblocks that it creates because of the colonial baggage, etc., would be to kind of partner with nations such as a Japan or a South Korea, especially in these mega projects, which are more likely to see more participation from the Indian side, and Myanmar being more open to that. And I think in Mandalay, that sense was more given the antipathy that the Chinese feel. I mean, what the Myanmarese feel towards China, specifically in Mandalay, but you see a kind of different story that emerges in Yangon as well. So I think, apart from just looking at ourselves or India as this probably gateway or a friendship or an opposition ally to India, I think it's good to partner and understand how the identities of these different ethnicities play out and how they impact our own identities, and then push forward in the economic sense in that by partnering with other nations. And I think that seems like a more realistic proposition than saying that India can come in and be this, let's say, an opposition factor or a balancer to China. And I think that will be more incommensurate with the geopolitical realities and the social structure that is in Myanmar and the complexity of that. So that was just my 2 cents. And I had some couple of questions for Professor Shastri and Bertil Lintner, sir, as well. Sir, could I go ahead with those questions, Aditya?
Go right ahead. Go right ahead.
Okay. One was, of course, these are like broad questions. Both of you can answer them. One is, if you're looking at this whole disciplined democracy and the question of the constitutional amendment and how those changes would play out. Of course, the rules have been written by the military themselves, and everybody knows about this 25% and the block that fails. But there was this really interesting article in the New York Times by Jason Gellert, and he talks about how the Myanmarese constitution can be amended if Aung San Suu Kyi wishes to do so. And he gives this interesting proposition where he says that the upper limit or the maximum strength of the militaries and their quota within the constitution has been defined, which is at 25%, but the lower number hasn't been. And back when he was writing this article, the NLD had quite a bit of majority, and today they've come back with a little more majority of their own. So his contestation is therefore, as a constitutional expert, saying that you could lower the limit, therefore, through the 69%. You don't need the 75% amendment in that bracket. You could bring in the 69%. And then given that, today NLD has that kind of majority, there could be a change in the constitution. Your thoughts on this perspective? Do you think it would gain traction? Another one is regarding the comparison of opposition parties between India and Myanmar. How legitimate is the USDP? And, it has won seats in the cantonment areas and etc. But how legitimate is the USDP and its claims otherwise as being the opposition party? Because I think there are certain rubrics that need to be fulfilled if you're calling yourself an opposition party. And given that scenario, then would all the people who are in that unselected or not decided rate therefore push towards NLD and then reflect a popularity that perhaps doesn't exist? Because a lot of criticism has come in the way of, you've seen posters and pictures that have gone viral with people worshipping Aung San Suu Kyi, and a lot of questions have been raised regarding that as well. Are we again seeing a new form of, dictatorship and things like that? People have gone even to that extent in making these claims. Your opinions on the same. And of course, this whole linkage of the Panglong Peace Conference, and how do you think that would progress? I understand these are very large questions, but I thought...
Yeah, I think we'll only be able to take the first two for now, Soumya. So go right ahead, Dr. Shastri, all yours.
Dr. Ramya, those are extremely important questions. I'll precede that by two small comments about the broader points you raised. When you look at, when you compared the Chinese investment on the two sides of the border in Pakistan and in Myanmar, I would say I would like to budget in three factors to try and explain what's happening with regard to the slow pace of investment by the Chinese in Myanmar. And three factors for me are, firstly, of course, the Chinese are also waiting and watching the battle that happens between the democratic forces and the military. The military has its own perspectives on Chinese investment. When you talk to military leaders, you find that different perspectives coming in. Secondly, I think it's also important the geographical locations where a lot of this investment is happening, or proposed to happen at least. A lot of that deals with areas which are in conflict, and therefore there is a uncertainty as to whether that conflict can be dealt with for that investment to happen. And thirdly, I think if you look at Aung San Suu Kyi's style of leadership ever since she became state councillor, her approach has been that nobody should be able to take her for granted. And this is very much seen in the way she has dealt with the Chinese. To your two specific questions, I would not believe that it would be easy to circumvent the present constitution, and I wouldn't really buy the argument which the New York Times article states. I would see there's an alternate route. I say, you see, are we investing too much in the constitution as a roadmap for the way forward? I would invest much more in the Panglong conference, and I would invest much more in the fact that she has come back now with the greater legitimacy and would to a certain extent put the military on a slight back foot. I'm not saying that the military is going to reduce its role or is going to step back. No, I'm not saying that for a moment. But I'm saying that the fact that she has come with a bigger majority would give her a little more bargaining space, especially with the various ethnic armed groups and going for a peace accord. Now, if that were able to happen, I think the solutions would come not within the constitution, but outside the constitution. We would be moving towards a resolution. Finally, on the USDP, now I think historically USDP has been that party which has had the support of the military, and as an opposition to the NLD, we need to see it in that context. Yes, does it fit into a democratic frame? I think you need to look at the transitional frame that Myanmar is in, and therefore the USD tends to play that role. And I would say in some of the states of Myanmar, the USDP has actually done well in regions outside the cantonment also. So that's something which we will need to look at a little more closely. And finally, of course, I think at the end of the day, I think is largely dependent on the way the leadership.
Dr. Shastri, can you just turn off your video? Again, we're losing your audio.
Did we ever imagine 5 years back that, that's my last point. I'm saying, would any of us have imagined a situation in 2015 that the position of state councillor would be created and this position of state councillor would receive legitimacy in other countries of the world? You see, so I think the democratic process has its own way of ensuring that you circumvent legal norms that are created, and I see a possibility of that in the months and years ahead.
Okay, Bertil, on to you.
Yeah, I'm very glad that you brought up this thing about the colonial heritage, what's left over from the colonial days, because it is still an issue. And Indians are usually called, they are called Burma Gala, it is a pejorative. But interestingly, people like me are called Galapu. It means white Indians.
It's also called for, like, I think peace, because that's what they traded in as well, right? I'm sorry to interrupt.
But I think India is actually quite is aware of this problem. And of course, during the British time, Indians were brought in to run the railways and the post offices and telegraphs. And with them came business people, and they settled in all the major cities of the country. And remember that before World War II, 60% of the population of Yangon was Indian. It was a majority. So obviously, it's something that came with the colonial power, which hasn't always been yet welcomed by the population at large. But I think India has been fairly sensitive and aware of this issue. Remember that one of the first Indian ambassadors to Myanmar, Burma in those days, was Robert Kating, Naga. It was followed by George Gilbert Swell, the Kazi. And there have always been Northeasterners at the embassy in Yangon. And it's a way of showing the Burmese, look, we got this kind of people too, you know. We don't know, all of us, we don't look the same. But I think among younger people, that is not so much an issue anymore, really. It is more, what can I say? Among radical groups, it is more anti-Muslim than anti-Indian. And that is actually not a very healthy sign either. Because I mean, the majority of the Indians who came to Myanmar during the colonial days were Muslims, mostly from the north, but also from the south. But there's also, as you know, a very large Hindu community in Yangon and elsewhere. And I don't think they're feeling quite the same kind of pressure on the population as the Muslims are. It's interesting that you mentioned this state councillor, and that this post was created after the 2015 election because Aung San Suu Kyi cannot become the president because her two sons are not Myanmar citizens. But her legal advisor at that time, the person who actually came up with that title, his name was Ukoni. He was a Myanmar Muslim. His father was born in Lucknow and was an immigrant who married a Burmese lady, and then he stayed on. So he would be a Gala in the eyes of people who wanted to see it in racist terms. But he was nevertheless immensely popular. And as you know, he was assassinated at the airport in Yangon when he came back from a conference in Indonesia. I went to the funeral, and there was 20,000, 30,000 people there, not only Muslims. It is an issue, and it will remain an issue, but I think with more interaction, with more people-to-people contacts, whatever, I think those colonial days will, pass into history. Then you have, of course, the China factor, the China-Myanmar economic corridor. You're absolutely correct that Myanmar has been downsizing almost all aspects of it. It started with, Midson, naturally, which was suspended. But even the Chakpyu deep sea port is no longer what they had planned from the very beginning. The Yangon new city, which is a mega project, is also now becoming under scrutiny, and it will probably be downsized as well. So you're probably right in saying that the Chinese realize that these big mega projects are not going to impress anyone. Therefore, it's better to concentrate on smaller projects. But smaller projects very often hide the bigger picture. And if you look at the MOUs which were signed, they don't look that great, really. It's some kind of river port in Kachin State, and there's some other river ports on the Irrawaddy River, some tunnel here and there. But if you put it together, you can see a pattern here. That river port is below a bridge on the Irrawaddy River, and no big vessels can pass under that bridge. So it makes perfect sense to build a new river port beyond the bridge. And the other river ports they are going to build, the same thing. It all points at they want to develop the Irrawaddy River into a major artery for trade, for access to the Indian Ocean. Maybe it's an alternative to the proposed high-speed railway, which no one really wants to have anyway. So the Chinese are actually, as you said, concentrating on the smaller projects. You put them together and you can get a more complete picture of what they're actually up to. And what, because we have to remember that from China's point of view, Myanmar is of utmost strategic importance. They're not going to let it go, no matter what.
All right, yeah, that settles it. I want to move to Dr. Sripati Narayanan. Go right ahead, sir.
Hello, good evening to all of you, and thank you, Dr. Takshashila and the team for inviting me here to be your discussant. I would also like to thank the two speakers for their erudite presentation. As Mr. Lintner had mentioned in his speech, this election result was not unexpected and was neither exciting, because given the political landscape and the way the political setup has evolved in Myanmar, expecting NLD to be the largest player was a given. The question was, will they outdo their previous electoral outing or not? And who is going to be coming a distant number 3 and a distant number 2? That being said, most discussion most conversation about India's neighbors in India revolves around broadly two issues. One, what is the nature of the relationship and what does it imply in the near future, any specific development? And second, the Chinese role. But in a country like Myanmar, especially, and this also holds true with all the Indian neighbors, including Pakistan and Afghanistan, is that to understand the complexity of the domestic politics is very important. And for most Indian viewers, it's like the domestic politics in India's neighborhood is as complicated, as vibrant, and as exciting as the domestic politics in India. It is no more a Congress BJP tussle as is the case at the national level, but at the individual provinces, the dynamics changes. But what is unique about Myanmar and which makes Myanmar very fascinating is that there is a third entity, which is the ethnic armed groups. In Myanmar, it is just not an issue of the dominant ethnicity, which is the Barman, who constitute about 2/3 of the population, and the other ethnic groups, and such kind of parallels can be seen in many parts of the world. But you've got 3 or 4 players. One is the dominant ethnic group, which is split into two: the mainstream political party and that mainstream entity which is outside electoral politics and street politics and public discourse, which is the RV. NLD represents the electoral politics, the democratic variant. You've got the ethnic political parties, and then you've got the ethnic armed groups. Now, within the ethnic political parties, there are some political parties which are independent or enjoying a certain degree of political independence, and then there are few political parties which are front, either of the state machinery, which is the Tatmadawa, the army, or the ethnic armed groups. So, given this fascinating landscape, to study Myanmar and to study Myanmar election as it stands itself was for me an exciting proposition and one which I enjoyed. Now, coming to what the key takeoff of this election is that I will just shoot off with three or four couple of simple questions, which I hope my speakers and my fellow panelists can pitch in. Is that Aung San Suu Kyi is 75. Much has been invested on the image of Aung San Suu Kyi, not only domestically but also internationally. The fact that, as one of the speakers had mentioned, that Aung San Suu Kyi was made state councillor, a post of questionable constitutional legitimacy. As the constitution clearly states that the president shall head the government. You have this super power center revolving around Aung San Suu Kyi, which has been acknowledged and recognized as a power center not only internationally but also domestically. So she being 75, what is going to be the future of Myanmar politics? Not for the next 5 years, but after 5 years. If next time when Myanmar goes to election, she will be 80. Yes, in this part of the world, we have got a unique experience. Politicians don't die, don't retire, and they don't die young. Mahathir Mohamad made a comeback at 93. But jokes and Lee Kuan Yew never left government. He only took a back seat. So in that sense, like what next? Does NLD have a team B in place? Does Myanmar, the establishment or the deep state of Myanmar have plan B? Who is going to be the poster boy whom you're going to sell? And in Myanmar, there's one country which actually has a deep state, which is the army. And I must give credits, and which is something which no one would do and no one would like to be seen doing. But as a political analyst, you must acknowledge and appreciate the political ingenuity and the deep understanding of political science that the army has learned over years. Is that when they introduced the 7-step road to democracy in 2007 and the new constitution, the army was very smart. It still retains and controls the reins of power where it matters, but it does not hold the risk. It is no more responsible for the issues of governance, but has got the authority of government. 1/4 of the parliament is controlled by the army. You've got 3 presidents, 1 president and 2 vice presidents. 1 vice president is an army candidate. The defense ministry, the home minister, and the border security minister are appointed by the army chief, and the members and the army, the nominated members of parliament, are nominated by the army chief. So basically, the army.
Dr. Narayan, sorry, we're just a little over 10 minutes left. So if you can just ask them any questions.
So that case, so we have to actually look at what is the thinking. Second is that when you're looking at, so this is the constitutional aspect, and most of us forget this constitutional aspect, and we end up going on taking it as a democratic exercise. So when you had the introduction of democracy in Myanmar, it was basically a shifting of burden and not transition of complete authority. So in this sense, what is the I'm going to do? Second question which I have is that on the ethnic front, because in the past few months, I'm not even taking the whole 5-year tenure, is that the Arakan army and the Arakan state, they've got NLD candidates being kidnapped by the Arakan army, fierce fighting. In the Shan state, you've got violence resuming on the eve of election. And in the Shan state, election results have not gone in favor of NLD. Mind you, sir, is that the Shan state, right from the 90s, has not been voting with the mainstream Myanmar. The Shan state has always voted different from the overall electoral result. So in that sense, what does this election mean for the ethnic reconciliation? Whether it be in the second Bangalore conference among the ethnic armed groups or even among the population. Third, and the final point, which is the most important point, vis-a-vis if you look at in terms of India-Myanmar or India's concerns about Myanmar and China, the Chinese role in Myanmar, was that a month before the election, the Indian Foreign Secretary, and the Chief of Army jointly undertook a visit to Myanmar. Two important points. One, I think this is the first or second such incident where the Army Chief and the Foreign Secretary have visited a foreign country together. Second, a month before, and which was also followed by we transferring Indian submarine, handing over an Indian submarine to Myanmar, and thus making it the first submarine of Myanmar, is that we have kind of separated political relationship or India's relationship with Myanmar vis-a-vis its domestic affairs. So in that sense, in the long term, and Myanmar accepting an Indian submarine, traditionally, if you really look at the world, there's the Chinese that have been doling out big ticket or platforms that capture public imagination, whether it be in case of Pakistan or Bangladesh. But Myanmar accepting Indian submarine and India readily willing to transfer one when domestically the requirement of the forces is much higher than what we have. Itself is a sign that Myanmar is willing to move away from China if there is an opportunity. Yes, as Mr. Lintner said, is that the Chinese investment is no more big ticket. I think they have learned the mistakes of Cpec, no, not on of Cpec 1 and also BRI the last few years, going for big ticket items, and they not hitting the nail on the head can actually be a cause of embarrassment. They are going for small projects, which is actually securing their investment. So in that sense, it's that how are the Chinese going to now play the ethnic card? Much of the ethnic armed groups are directly or indirectly dependent on China. The Kachin,
Dr. Narayanan, I'm going to have to ask the panelists to respond to what you've brought up so far. Sorry, we're really out of time. Dr. Shastri, go right ahead.
Okay, I'll just take 2 minutes to make 2 points. Dr. Narayan, Dr. Sripati, I fully accept the point about the apparent contradiction between an extra constitutional position and the recognition question. But my own argument would be constitutional roadblocks and legal roadblocks. The solution for me would not be seen as being extra constitutional, because your constitution puts in certain limitations, so you circumvent that. And the fact that the councillor's position has been recognized by several countries across the world, I think goes to prove the point that this was, in that sense, for me at least, a masterstroke done by the advisor to, suggested by the advisor of Aung San Suu Kyi. Point number 2, I think it's important for us to note that in this election, especially in the Shan state, the NLD has actually increased its tally as compared to the last election. And the local party, the SNLD, their seats have actually come down. The SNLD has won less than 40% of the seats to the national parliament. And they enjoyed much more, they had a much larger number of seats earlier. Where the NLD has done relatively badly is the Rakhine state. That is where the party has not done well. But what's working for the advantage of the NLD is, in the Rakhine state, the ANP has several factions, and each faction has won different seats. So I think there has been a split among the ethnic groups, which has to a certain extent worked to the advantage of the NLD. I thought I would just make those 2 points.
Thank you. Bertil?
Yeah, I think a very important question came up there, and that is how all Aung San Suu Kyi was going to happen after her probably final term as state councillor. That is a major weakness on the part of the NLD. There's not really been trained a second generation of leaders. And exactly why that is the case is very hard to say. I know that there are certain younger people in the NLD who are being not exactly groomed to take over, but at least have been encouraged to take a more active part in party politics. They are not former activists, they are more on the business side of things. But then another important thing is that I'm not really commented on party politics at all because it's not really my thing. But I was asked before the election to write some kind of curtain raiser for Asia Times, and I said, no, I don't want to do that. I'm not a fortune teller. I know that the NLD is going to win, and that's it. But I did write this story after the election. And the question I raised there, which I think is an important one, is that for many years, the only legally permitted political party in the country was the Burma Socialist Program Party, the militarist party, which in 1988 became the National Unity Party. It was thrashed completely in the 1990 elections. And then they set up the new party, the USDP, which was actually USDA to begin with. It's a kind of mass organization modeled after Indonesia's Golkar. They're not taking part in 2 elections and not made much headway at all. For how much longer will the military continue to support losers? Why not support the winner? Why not move closer to the NLD and establish a relationship with NLD and forget about these other parties? And if you look at the leadership of the USDP, there's a very old, retired army officers who the young officers in the military have no allegiance to at all, really. I mean, this is pure speculation, but I think what we're going to see from now on is a closer relationship between the NLD and the military, and where certain army officers will probably play a more important role in politics than they've done so far. Exactly how that is going to be done is hard to say, because they can't as long as they are in uniform and so on. But I think that's what we should be watching here for the future, that the USDP is always described as the pro-military party, the militarist party. I wouldn't say that anymore. If I were a Burmese army general, I would dump them.
Okay. We are almost out of time, but before we wrap up, I do want to get in Mr. PM Heblikar. He's the person who's really helped us organize this whole series of webinars. So over to you, sir. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you, Aditya. I think my predecessors on this panel have covered the ground well. I just want to add 2 or 3 points. The first is what attracts India's national security concerns in Myanmar is the so-called China-Myanmar economic corridor. In my view, it is not a new development. It started sometime in the mid-80s when Tang Xiaoping decided that he will bring prosperity to Yunnan province. That's how we began to look at the Irrawaddy as a transit point to the Bay of Bengal. So the BRI is only a new coat for the old project. The second thing we need to understand is that whenever China enters into infrastructure development programs, China is there to stay. Right from 1988 to 2000 odd, China invested in all the infrastructure projects in Myanmar. There was nothing in it that gave any thought to the civilian population. I think we need to be very clear. China was abandoned by the West for wrong reasons, and the sanctions which are now in position are going to be very, very colonial in nature. They're not serving their purpose. India was the first country that broke the sanctions in 1995 when we gave them a $10 million line of credit. I think India's interests in Myanmar are deep. I don't think we need to be extraordinarily worried about the Chinese presence there. We need to develop our own sinews, our own muscles, and we need not necessarily depend on the military as a crutch or the NLD. We need to reach out to the population at large. And have we done this? And many more things that Dr. Shastri spoke about the high-tech program. Today, India has given Myanmar in excess of $2 billion in developmental funds. I'll tell you a simple thing. In 1996, when I was posted in Myanmar, I asked a very senior officer of the then DDSI, the alternate government then. He said, look, we want Myanmar to develop economically, and we will go the way of Indonesia. It might take 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and I don't think he is wrong. I think there is some connection to what he said. Myanmar wants to develop. He says the army's concern is to protect Myanmar's territorial integrity so that people don't just secede and go away. The last point which is one needs to make is how do we see Myanmar November 8, 2020 onwards to 2025. It's going to be a period of stability. 80%, 90% of the military has voted for NLD, if you look at the results. The military is in one way indirectly pro-democracy, as one would say, because there has not been a coup since 1988. The military has, reworked itself in power. So I think there is a greater realization that in India, we need to understand that whatever be their politics, what is it that we are going to bring to the table and how are we going to manage this? And it's not only the government of India's lines of credit which we are extending, it is the other areas of concerns where, we talk about education, we talk about medical health, we talk about industries. Where are we? There are, if you look at the Myanmar's economic development policy, which was in 2018, opportunities are galore for Indians. Don't go into the solar industry because it has been destroyed by the Chinese. Look at other areas. Why don't we develop ports in the southern part of Myanmar? What is holding us back? Why do we have to say that the Chinese are here? Chinese are in Sri Lanka. What have we done about it? So we have to live with this Chinese threat. As long as it does not cross into India's eastern periphery, is fine for us. But we have something which is out of the box. We have to bring in new thought processes as to how to deal with this. And it might cost you $1 billion more, but it's worth it because I think 85% of the Burmese population, Myanmar population, believe that India is a true friend. Like what Dr. Ramya said, you go to Mandalay and drive out, you come across Kokangs who are not Burmese anyway. They are tribes who come from Shan state. So I think there are a lot of mix. I don't think that we need to be worried about the Chinese influence in Myanmar. We need to understand how we have to accelerate our own, hold on power, and how do we get in there and stay there for the long run. That is what we need to do. What China does is something that China has already been there 30 years ahead of us in funding Myanmar. I think it's up to about $17 billion, if I'm not mistaken. Bertil had brought out a very, very interesting document a few years ago as to how China was wanting to diversify, Myanmar wanted to diversify away from China, how the army wanted to bring in democracy. And if Bertil next time shares us some salient points of the document, I think all of us will be very wise, especially people who create policies in Delhi. It's a very, very fascinating document. I think with these few words, let me first thank Suesh for having been with me throughout this journey to bring this to the table, and to the management of TI for having shown faith that we can do deep webinars like this, and to my fellow panelists who responded to my request to be on board. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hebikar. On that note, we are going to wrap up at 3 minutes over. Thank you all so much for joining us. And, the very fact that this discussion has gone over just shows how much there is to be discussed about this topic. And this is just not just been interesting, it's very rare to have a discussion like this in India. So thank you all. And we hope to have more such discussions in the future. Yeah, we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will also, before we wrap up, just mention that we do have our PGP course. It's a roughly 1-year course in public policy, and it begins on the 16th of January. So anybody who's interested can just log into the Takshashila website,